Hi, I'm Kinko, a software engineer at Google, and I'd like to talk about a vision. It's called Instant and Seamless. Its challenges and how we plan to address these challenges to make it real. The vision is basically about drastically improving user experience of loading and navigation, and that of transitions between the web content in general. Yeah, I'll open up the permission later. Thanks for raising that. Okay, and this is worked by multiple teams, and we plan to have a set of sessions that talk more about details so that you may want to check out these as well. So let me start with a simple problem statement. We've been making tons of improvements on the web, but we still hear that web feels slow and sluggish. There can be multiple factors, like what web core vitals try to capture, but our problem statement is simple and hasn't changed. When user wants to browse web content, they need to keep filling navigations or waiting for the pages to load. This is because browsers basically need to fetch things for the next page after user makes an action to visit the page. And while waiting for the page to load, the user can see either the previous or the next content in a complete way. This feels very suboptimal, and we want to fix this. Meanwhile, this is how we imagine things should work. Hope you see the differences. So on the right side, it shows how we want content load should become. When user wants to see a new content, the load should finish very quickly, or ideally it should just finish instantly. Going back should feel the same. So our ideal end state is that both next and back navigations finish instantly. And on the right side, it shows how we even want this concept to advance so that the transitions between pages feel seamless. Ideal end state here is that the contents that user may want to shop around should be able to load and coexist without losing the continuity, while just the user's primary focus can transition from one to another. There's no longer a clear disruptive moment between before and the next pages. There are multiple pages that just coexist and are intuitively linked to one another through transitions. This is the key concept of instant and seamless. So I hope that the vision is now clear. The next question is, of course, how. As you may imagine, there are multiple ways to achieve instant or making web page load faster and thus closer to instant. For example, we can do things in advance. This can be done by prefetching or prerendering pages. Another popular technique is cache and restore the majority of the page. Notable example here would be BFCache or back-forward cache. More straightforward and the generic approach would be, for example, to optimize everything so that every step becomes faster. The impact might be limited, but this is very generic and effective in most cases. Yet another approach could be, for example, parallelizing more steps. These approaches can be combined, or there will be more, but let me just move on. For instant and seamless, we primarily focus on the first two approaches, do things in advance and cache and restore. Other approaches can be combined too, but these two are the key to make things feel not just faster, but instant. The rest of the talk will focus more on the doing things in advance part, while we will also mention BFCache, as they share the same vision and the underlying technologies. You'll soon start to see that. Okay, so now that we talked about instant, let's also see the approach for seamless. Here, a key is to keep showing the context between transitions, and therefore, for example, when we do things in advance, we also want to keep both the current and the next pages around. And this can be done by extending the concept of prerendering even further to something like preview. Or if we see it from API point of view, this is what portals do. At this point, you can probably start to see linkages between the technologies like prerender or preview and the BFCache. For both cases, we somehow load pages, keep them around, and swap the focused pages between back and forward or between previous and next. Note that when we talk about transitions pages, instant loading is a precondition of seamless. But there are also other technologies for seamless that are more orthogonal to these. For example, shared element transitions. But in this talk, I won't go into details of it. So let me also briefly show the same thing with some visuals. So this is an illustration of how page load works today. When the user taps the target link, the navigation starts to happen by fetching the main resource. It will be parsed, processed, and will trigger more resource fetches. But until the critical resource is to be processed and rendered, the user needs to keep having the disruptive moment. Then this shows how things could work instead. As you can see, the browser can start prefetching resources and then pre-rendering the page before the user actually makes the action or taps the destination link. This needs to happen when the source page or the browser has a good confidence that the next page is requested. But if it happens, the transition to the next page becomes instant. Similarly, if the page can be prefetched, pre-rendered, and previewed with portals in the way that source and the destination page collaborate to realize a seamless end-to-end experience, the transition to the next page will be instant and seamless. Lastly, if the page that the user wants to visit is in BFCache, the transition to it can again be instant. The common high-level scenario is that we already have or want to have the page for the next transition before switching to the page can happen. Okay, so but as you can imagine, actually achieving these had multiple challenges. Especially, you may recall that Chrome used to have pre-rendering, but it was turned down. You want to know what are the challenges, what has been changed, how we plan to address these. For example, challenge number one, how do we preserve privacy while making, for example, pre-render before user action? Number two, how do we make sure the hidden pages, like pre-rendering pages, do not make undesirable side effects? Number three, how can these complex features be supported by the architecture and how can it be maintained? Number four, how do we make this usable and useful by developers via the API story? And number five, this all sounds complex. How do we make this incrementally achievable by developers and what edge adoption story? There could be more, but let me start with the first one. So privacy-based restrictions. So by definition, prefetch, prerender, and preview or pre-star for cross-origin pages is risky in terms of privacy because it needs to start fetching things from other origins before the user makes the actual action. Our basic strategy here is to comply and follow the W3C's target privacy threat model. Namely, we take care of controlling and or protecting the data that may be shared with the target origin before the user's action. And here, our approaches are basically we strip out cookies, user agent, and other potentially personally identifiable information from resource requests before they are sent to the target origin. And we basically disallow storage access before real navigation. And we also intend to block communication channels to the same extent that we prevent it with a cross-site link opened in a new tab. This means that we are going to block post message, broadcast channel, credentialed fetches, sizing side channels, maybe shared in the service workers too, etc. So let me talk more about restrictions on the pre-rendering and the previewing pages. In addition to these privacy-based restrictions, hidden pages or the pages that are not supposed to get users' attention should not have undesirable side effects. For example, we want to restrict, we don't want to show permission dialog from pre-rendering pages, so any permissions API features should be restricted. Similarly, we want to restrict any features that may show something visible to the users, like showing pop-ups or dialogues, or something that plays audio, vibrates something, or do anything that is unexpected. So it's tough to go through all these, but at the spec level, we are going to do this because if these restrictions are not specified or defined, the feature will be unpredictable and non-interoperable. At the input level, in addition to implementing API by API restrictions, we also plan to implement some blanket control at the module layer so that we can always start with restricting any potentially risky activities in the page that talk to outside the page. Let's talk about the underlying architecture now. As you can imagine, these features are complex and hard to implement. But if you squint enough, you will see the same common underlying infrastructure that can support all these. Our plan here is that we implement the common infrastructure. It's called NP-arc that supports multiple active pages in a tab, so that the code that is needed for each feature can leverage the shared architecture. This re-architecture itself entails a large amount of code changes, but in a gist, there will be two high-level changes that tab or web content. It's going to have multiple pages or frame trees. And we will have new types of navigations that move pages between frame trees. You'll be interested in hearing more. So there will be NP-arc talk. It's scheduled today, roughly 1 or 2 hours from now. Okay, so let me also start with talk about API story. So making sure that these changes we intend to make for any instant and seamless work have a good interoperable API story. And of course, discussion with the community is critical for us. For prerender, we have existing API that's called link-rel prerender. You might know about it. It used to be a bit underspecified. So here our intent is to revamp the entire API shape in an interoperable way. This shares a lot with portals, and it consists of triggering API, opting API, it changes in fetch, and the restrictions in the JavaScript API for the browsing context. The triggering API is for the source page. It will be something like or extension of link-rel prerender. While we are also thinking about like a new API that offers a drop-in speed up for same origin cases that can speed up navigations for the same origin for your site. I mean, opting API is for target pages. There needs to be a way to express that they are okay to be fetched without credentials. So we are going to define that too. We also think that changes in fetch mode is needed in order to support speculative and also uncredentialed fetches. We need the specification too for restrictions in the JavaScript APIs for the browsing context that is prerendering. And there also needs to be a way to let the page knows if it's prerendering or not, and if and when their storage becomes available. Let me also mention that there are also multiple important standard discussions happening for BFCache, and examples of discussions are, for example, before unload and unload handling, possible opt-out API, or how the browsing context subs or something like that. You can check out more about these in the Web APIs talk and the BFCache talk. Okay, then let me talk about the adoption story. We believe that defining a clear interoperable API is important, and having very clear restrictions on the browsing context is also useful, while we also understand that making this API adaptable is important. Our strategy here is that we provide options that are easier to start with limited benefits, whereas the page to do more, we want to unlock newer level of improved instant and seamless experience. For example, by default, sites may or may not be eligible for BFCache, and the page may be able to be pre-rendered only when UA or browsers can be sure that sending uncredentialed requests can work. It can be the case even without opting when, for example, browsers do not have cookies and credentials for the target page. We are also considering making some restrictions work in like a soft restriction. For example, browsers can delay or defer the actual behavior when some restricted asynchronous API is called, or can imagine that let it silently fail without canceling the prerendering or previewing when it's relevant. While if the target page starts to support dynamical personalization after navigation, then it will become possible that the page can be pre-rendered without credentials, and then later can update some of the pages with personalized content when the storage becomes available. It will need more work, but the page will be pre-rendering eligible in a lot more cases, and the user experience will become a lot better. Note that in order to support same origin cases, this work will not be needed. Then finally, if the page starts to support previews via portals or shared element transitions, the overall user experience of the transitions between the source and the destination pages will no longer feel like a disruptive navigation, but will be an instant and seamless transition. Want to make sure that this incremental adoption path is easy or like reasonable to follow and well lit. Okay, so I have a recap slide. We talked about some challenges and approaches. I talked about privacy-based restrictions and how those restrictions will be applied. We talked about shared NP-ARC architecture. We talked about the API story and how the adoption story can be like. Let me quickly talk about the current status. BFCache, this has a kind of a celebrating moment. That initial version shipped in Chrome M86, and it supports cross-origin cases. Pre-render, or just started working on that and started landing code. It's largely work in progress. We are aiming for running the first experiment sometime in the first half of next year. And the new spec proposal is getting in a very good shape as well, which is it's available. I created a bit.ly link so that you can probably follow. For portals, same origin trial was run in M85 to M86, and it's going to re-architecture the code on top of the new architecture, NP-ARC, before the actual launch. A lot of work is also shared with Prerender, and we're working very closely with NP-ARC. Prototypes there, and the prototype for pre-rendering now does not immediately crash, which is great. The team is finalizing the details of the design, and the active discussion and the more auditing of potential changes are ongoing. And that's about it. As I mentioned earlier, there will be a set of sessions that talk more about each work, and you can definitely check out these. And that's it. We still have a few minutes, I think, so probably can get some questions. Thanks. Did you have anything? Okay. Or you can probably express. Yeah, go ahead.
So the site initially renders uncredentialed. After you do the navigation, is there any opportunity to gain credentials, or is that not possible?
The plan is that we grant all the storage access and the credentials once the real navigation happens. And there's a discussion that we fire some event or something to let the page know that now is the time you can update your page or some components. More details will probably be covered by Jeremy's talk. Jeremy, do you want to add anything here?
I don't think I've got a lot to add. Yeah, I mean, generally, sites should have access to their credentials once they've been navigated to, and we're investigating how we can make that happen without giving credentials up front. There's a little bit more detail in my talk later today. Obviously, you can reach out anytime. There's another question in the Slack chat. Jose de Pena asks, is Portal's work also adding some way to improve experience transitioning to a different tab? I see many times the use case of launching in a new tab that could benefit from pre-rendering. I mean, Dominic's typing. I don't know if he's typing an answer to that, but it's an interesting thought. MPArch currently doesn't provide as good way in the Chromium implementation to take a pre-rendered content either from a portal or from a pre-render and put it into a new tab. I think that certainly is an interesting use case. I think the priority on that is probably a little lower until unless we discover that that's a very common use case relative to link navigation inside the same tab.
Yeah, so I think in general, pre-rendering architecture should work for new tabs, like on a spec level. Like there's nothing theoretically preventing it. As Jeremy says, the priority is probably lower for implementation, at least at first. Portals is a little trickier because if you have a portal and then you try and pop that portal into a new tab, you have these two tabs which are disconnected from each other, whereas normally portals have this like predecessor relationship where the portal page can adopt its predecessor maybe. There's probably still ways to make it work, whether it's an opt-in or something, but we haven't looked at that too much in detail yet.
So my understanding in that question and the various responses to it was that it's all talking about notifying the client-side JavaScript that they're now credentialed. Is there any opportunity for the site to be told who their user is and that the user we're sending the original request down opaquely, correct?
I mean, I think the expectation, like we don't like dynamically issue like a ping back to the original server when navigation actually occurs. My expectation would be that client-side JavaScript could send such a request if they wanted to, but I don't see a strong reason for us to build that as an explicit feature of the specification. If you see a reason that would be very valuable, we can discuss further.
Well, my quick thought would be imagining that there's a very different experience that a logged-in user gets, and to tell the site, hey, this is the request. Maybe please just send me the checksum on the data that you would have given on this request. And if it's totally different from that uncredentialed checksum that you just got back, you might want to basically start from scratch. I'm thinking that this might prevent the basically breaking sites experiences from using BFCache or using uncredentialed content.
BFCache is doesn't I don't think factor into this, right? Because content that enters the BFCache was already loaded at the top level page and already had access to its credentials. As far as we do recognize that sites may present different content to credentialed users from uncredentialed users. Sites can opt out of, well, firstly, cross-origin sites have to opt into this. Secondly, we want to give sites the opportunity to say, oh, this response actually isn't appropriate for pre-rendering, and then I'll just abort the pre-rendering. If their site does need to make radical adaptations, maybe pre-rendering isn't a useful thing for that site, or they can have logic client-side to determine whether they need to throw everything away and just do a full refresh, and that refresh would occur, with credentials. Ideally, you would hope that a large amount of content would have a fair amount of either application code or content that is common to credentialed, non-credentialed users. I think a lot of sites present substantially the same content, but present some additional options to logged in users. But there certainly will be sites for which this isn't appropriate. Like if, I won't be able to pre-render your bank account balance without your credentials, right? Like that's not gonna, there's some use cases that will be able to make less use of pre-rendering because of the fact that they can't do much work without credentials.
What about like cooperative cases? I mean, you could imagine same site or just sites that cooperate with each other, like maybe, I don't know, I guess we usually go to google.com, but you could imagine sites that know about each other, where they want to show something that you only have access to given authentication. I guess that's not possible.
So the same site is fairly easy. Sites that want to coordinate, you run into the fundamental problem of simultaneously. We're trying to combat sites coordinating in ways that users find inconsistent with their privacy objectives. And so we're sort of in this position where we're intentionally limiting the access to some of those credentials before the navigation occurs, so that it can't be used as a tracking vector in user agents that try to prevent that sort of tracking. So that's sort of the fundamental tension there, and trying to draw a line between there and to figure out what is like good coordination becomes pretty rocky.
But you mentioned that same origin is possible.
Yeah, so in the same origin case, we don't have any reason to deny credentials. And so our current plan is not to deny credentials.
Okay.
Thanks. So I think we are running about time. So thanks everyone to attend. Sorry for the initial glitches, but anyways, thanks for attending and thanks for the questions. Bye for now.